Imagine for a second that everything you've ever been told about the teachings of Jesus has been carefully filtered, edited, and twisted over 2,000 years of history. Picture this: an ancient text, maybe penned by one of the Galilean master's closest disciples, laying out a vision of his words and message that's radically different from what's been preached from pulpits for centuries. Today, we're diving headfirst into one of the most controversial and suppressed documents in Christian history, the Gospel of Thomas. Many specialists are convinced this text holds some of the most authentic words of Jesus ever preserved, and at the same time, it blows apart everything religious institutions have taught for ages. This isn't just some other lost apocryphal gospel buried in the sands of time. The Gospel of Thomas represents something far deeper, far more unsettling for the established Christian orthodoxy. Recent digs and deep dives suggest this text could have been put together as early as the canonical Gospels we all know. Some scholars even float the idea that certain sections might predate the very texts that made it into the New Testament. The fundamental difference: Thomas preserves a completely distinct tradition of Jesus' teachings, one that zeroes in on inner wisdom, direct knowledge, and the inherent divinity within every human being. These concepts clash head-on with the hierarchical structure and control-driven dogmas that the institutional church would later develop. The discovery of this gospel in Nag Hammadi back in 1945 was one of the 20th century's most significant archaeological finds for understanding early Christianity. Along with 52 other ancient texts, the Gospel of Thomas had been buried in the Egyptian desert for over 1,500 years, tucked away in ceramic jars that shielded these documents from the systematic destruction inflicted on so many other texts deemed heretical by the ecclesiastical authorities. Experts have determined these texts were deliberately hidden during the period when the Roman Church was solidifying its official doctrine and wiping out any alternative interpretations of the Christian message. History tells us that around the 4th century, when Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity and started the process of institutionalizing the faith, a systematic campaign kicked off to establish one single, uniform doctrine. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD wasn't just some theological powwow. It was a political event where they decided which texts were authentic and which would be declared heresy. Historical research reveals that the selection of canonical texts wasn't based purely on authenticity or age, but also on political considerations and the urgent need to create a religious structure that could serve as a tool for unification and social control within the Roman Empire. But the Gospel of Thomas throws a wrench into that official narrative. Unlike the canonical Gospels, which focus on Jesus' life, death, and resurrection as external events believers must accept on faith, Thomas concentrates exclusively on the direct words attributed to the Master. It presents his teachings as keys to unlocking an inner understanding that each person can experience firsthand. The text kicks off with a revolutionary declaration. These are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Didymus Judas Thomas recorded. And he said, "Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death." This radically different approach to Jesus' teachings points to a tradition that emphasized the direct experience of the divine realm as a present, accessible reality. That's a stark contrast to the later doctrine that would present salvation as something dependent on institutional mediation and the acceptance of specific dogmas. Specialists in early Christianity have identified elements in the Gospel of Thomas that might reflect the Jewish wisdom currents that influenced Jesus' movement, traditions that stressed the direct search for divine wisdom and inner knowledge as paths to spiritual enlightenment. Some scholars propose that Thomas might preserve sayings of Jesus that circulated in early Christian communities, ones that held on to a more mystical, less institutional interpretation of his teachings. This perspective is backed by linguistic analysis, suggesting that several sayings in Thomas show Semitic characteristics, potentially indicating their origin in Jesus' original Aramaic words, before their translation into Greek and subsequent adaptation to the doctrinal needs of Hellenistic communities. The content of the Gospel of Thomas is profoundly challenging for many of the core doctrines of institutional Christianity. While the canonical Gospels present Jesus emphasizing the importance of faith, obedience, and dependence on external religious structures, Thomas offers teachings that point toward self-inquiry, direct knowledge, and the realization of inner divinity. In one of its most controversial sayings, the text quotes Jesus declaring, "If your leaders say to you, 'Look, the kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, 'It is in the sea,' then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you. and it is outside of you. This teaching directly contradicts the notion that salvation depends on external religious authorities or the acceptance of specific dogmas. Instead of presenting the divine kingdom as a future reality achieved after death or through ecclesiastical mediation, Thomas suggests this reality is immediately accessible through self-knowledge and direct understanding. Research into first-century Jewish mystical traditions indicates that this perspective could reflect influences from wisdom currents that viewed divine knowledge as something each person could attain through contemplation and introspection. To truly grasp the meaning of the Gospel of Thomas and its connection to Jesus' original teachings, we've got to consider the religious and cultural backdrop against which the early Christian movement unfolded. First-century Judaism wasn't some monolithic religion. It was a complex mosaic of different currents and interpretations, ranging from aristocratic Sadducees to ascetic Essenes, legalistic Pharisees, and various apocalyptic and mystical groups. Experts have shown that the movement started by Jesus emerged within this diverse environment and likely incorporated elements from several of these traditions. Archaeological investigations at Qumran and other sites in the Judean desert have revealed the existence of communities that practiced highly developed forms of Jewish mysticism, including meditation techniques, allegorical interpretation of scriptures, and the direct pursuit of spiritual experiences. Some academics propose that Jesus' movement might have had connections to these mystical currents, which would explain why texts like the Gospel of Thomas preserve teachings that emphasize inner experience and direct knowledge rather than blind faith in external authorities. This perspective gains particular relevance when we consider that the process of Christian institutionalization involved not only the selection of canonical texts, but also the systematic elimination of interpretations that could challenge ecclesiastical authority. History shows us that during the early centuries of Christianity, numerous currents interpreted Jesus' teachings in ways radically different from what would later be declared orthodox. Gnosticism, of which the Gospel of Thomas is a part, represented one of these alternative currents that emphasized direct knowledge and personal experience of the divine over institutional faith and clerical mediation. The manuscripts unearthed at Nag Hammadi have revealed that during Christianity's first centuries, a thriving Gnostic tradition existed, preserving teachings of Jesus completely different from what we know through the canonical Gospels. These ancient texts show us that spiritual knowledge, or gnosis, wasn't considered a dangerous heresy, but the highest goal of the spiritual path. The Gospel of Thomas presents Jesus' teaching that each person carries within them a divine spark that can be awakened through deep self-knowledge, a perspective that fundamentally contradicts later Christian doctrine, which established the absolute necessity of ecclesiastical mediation for salvation. Modern research into Gnostic texts has shown that these communities developed sophisticated systems of spiritual practice, including contemplative meditation, symbolic interpretation of scriptures, and techniques to directly access elevated states of consciousness. Unlike the institutional Christianity that would later emerge, these groups didn't believe salvation depended on accepting specific dogmas or participating in rituals controlled by a clerical hierarchy. Instead, they taught that spiritual liberation came from awakening inner wisdom and recognizing the true divine nature of the human being. This fundamental difference explains why the Gospel of Thomas was excluded from the biblical canon, and why later ecclesiastical authorities put so much effort into eradicating these texts and persecuting those who preserved them. The process of biblical canonization, which primarily took place during the 3rd and 4th centuries, wasn't some neutral event guided solely by theological considerations. It was a complex political process reflecting power struggles within early Christianity. Preserved historical documents indicate that multiple versions of Christianity competed for legitimacy and authority, each with its own sacred texts and interpretations of Jesus' teachings. The version that ultimately prevailed wasn't necessarily the most faithful to the original teachings, but rather the one best suited to the needs of a centralized institutional structure seeking to establish uniform control over Christian beliefs and practices. Gnostic texts like the Gospel of Thomas posed a direct threat to this institutionalization project because they promoted individual spiritual autonomy and questioned the need for religious intermediaries. When we carefully analyze the content of the Gospel of Thomas, we find teachings that resonate deeply with mystical currents present in various ancient world spiritual traditions. For example, saying 3 declares that the kingdom of God is inside of you and outside of you, a perspective that echoes Hermetic philosophy, Neoplatonism, and various schools of Jewish mysticism flourishing in the Eastern Mediterranean region during the early centuries of our era. This convergence suggests that the teachings preserved in Thomas might represent an older, less filtered form of Jesus' original message, predating the elaborate doctrinal constructions that characterize later institutional Christianity. If this channel is opening your eyes to truths that have been hidden for centuries, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we're going to keep exploring the deepest mysteries of spiritual history that religious institutions have preferred to keep under wraps. Your support helps us continue investigating and sharing these revolutionary discoveries that are transforming our understanding of Jesus' original teachings. The differences between the Gospel of Thomas and the canonical Gospels go far beyond simple variations in narrative style or biographical details. They represent fundamentally different worldviews about the nature of the divine, the purpose of human existence, and the path to spiritual realization. While the canonical Gospels primarily present Jesus as an external Savior, whose sacrificial death is necessary for human redemption, the Gospel of Thomas presents him as a wisdom teacher, guiding his disciples toward discovering their own divine nature. This difference has profound implications for understanding not only what Jesus might have truly taught, but also how these teachings were later reinterpreted and modified to serve the interests of a developing institutional structure. Comparative studies of religions have shown that the perspective present in the Gospel of Thomas shares notable characteristics with mystical traditions that developed independently in other cultures. The insistence on self-knowledge as a path to the divine, the idea that the heavenly kingdom is a state of consciousness rather than a physical place, and the teaching that each person possesses the inherent capacity to achieve spiritual enlightenment without external mediation, are themes found in traditions as diverse as early Buddhism, Vedic Hinduism, Islamic Sufism, and Hermetic philosophy. This convergence suggests that the teachings preserved in Thomas might reflect a perennial wisdom that transcends specific cultural and religious limitations, a possibility that explains why these perspectives were perceived as threatening by those seeking to establish an exclusive and centrally controlled religious orthodoxy. The suppression of the Gospel of Thomas and other Gnostic texts wasn't some gradual natural process. It was a systematic and deliberate campaign that involved both the physical destruction of manuscripts and the persecution of the communities that preserved them. Historical documents reveal that during the 4th century, coinciding with Emperor Constantine's conversion and the subsequent officialization of Christianity, specific measures were implemented to eliminate texts considered heretical and to punish those who possessed or taught them. This repression wasn't limited to Gnostic texts, but also included other forms of Christianity that didn't conform to the emerging orthodoxy, including Arianism, Montanism, and various mystical currents that emphasized the direct experience of the divine. The modern rediscovery of these texts has forced scholars to fundamentally reconsider the history of early Christianity. It's no longer possible to cling to the simplified narrative of a unified Christian movement that organically developed from Jesus' teachings to the institutional form we know today. Instead, the evidence points to an initial period of extraordinary theological and practical diversity, during which multiple interpretations of Jesus' teachings coexisted and competed for acceptance. The fact that the institutional version of Christianity ultimately prevailed doesn't automatically validate its fidelity to the original teachings. Rather, it reflects the success of a particular political strategy in a specific historical context. This early theological diversity becomes evident when we examine not only the content of the Gospel of Thomas, but also the political and social circumstances surrounding its suppression. Historical research has revealed that the canonization process wasn't guided solely by theological or spiritual considerations, but was profoundly influenced by factors of political power and institutional control. Emperor Constantine, whose conversion marked a decisive turning point in Christian history, wasn't primarily a spiritual seeker, but a shrewd political strategist who recognized Christianity as a potential tool to unify and control his vast empire. The version of Christianity that he and his successors promoted was the one that best served these political objectives: a hierarchical, centralized religion with clearly defined doctrines and an authority structure that could effectively integrate with the imperial apparatus. The Gospel of Thomas, with its emphasis on individual spiritual authority, and its implicit rejection of institutional intermediaries represented a direct threat to this politico-religious project. Teachings that proclaimed each person could access divine truth directly without the need for priests, bishops, or ecclesiastical structures were fundamentally incompatible with a system that depended on authoritarian mediation to maintain social and political control. This tension explains why the suppression of Gnostic texts was so systematic and complete. It wasn't simply a difference of theological opinion, but a confrontation between two radically different visions of power and spiritual authority. The methods used to eliminate these texts and their supporting communities were remarkably effective. Archaeological studies have documented evidence of monastic libraries that were deliberately destroyed, manuscripts that were publicly burned, and entire communities that were dispersed or persecuted. The effectiveness of this suppression campaign is reflected in the fact that for over 1,500 years, these texts remained completely lost to the Western world, known only through critical references in the writings of their ecclesiastical opponents. When they were finally rediscovered in Nag Hammadi in 1945, they represented such a startling revelation that it took decades of academic work just to begin to understand their full significance. The accidental preservation of these texts in the sands of the Egyptian desert was itself a historical miracle, probably unanticipated by those who buried them. Evidence suggests that some monks, aware of the imminent persecution, made the risky decision to hide these manuscripts in the hope that they could be recovered in the future. Their act of clandestine preservation has provided us with a unique window into forms of Christianity that would otherwise have remained completely lost to history. This unintentional preservation has allowed modern scholars to reconstruct a much more complex and nuanced picture of early Christianity than had previously been possible. The specific content of the Gospel of Thomas reveals perspectives on the nature of spiritual reality that contrast sharply with later orthodox doctrines. While institutional Christianity developed elaborate theological systems that emphasized the distance between the human and the divine, requiring priestly mediation and adherence to specific creeds, the teachings preserved in Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas, hints at a direct pipeline between the individual seeker and spiritual truth. This isn't just some academic squabble. It has deep implications for how people understand their own spiritual potential and their relationship with established religious institutions. Linguistic deep dives have shown that many expressions in the Gospel of Thomas likely reflect older Aramaic formulations. That suggests these teachings might preserve oral traditions reaching back pretty close to the historical period of Jesus himself. This possibility is a big deal because it indicates that the theological perspectives found in Thomas weren't just later add-ons or heretical detours. Instead, they could represent some of the earliest, most authentic interpretations of the original teachings. If that hypothesis holds water, then the Gospel of Thomas shouldn't be seen as some radical alternative to true Christianity. It's more like a preservation of early Christian aspects that got sidelined later for reasons that had more to do with institutional politicking than theological fidelity. The way the teachings in Thomas line up with mystical traditions from other cultures also points to the possibility that these perspectives reflect universal insights into the nature of human consciousness and spiritual reality, rather than just specifically Christian religious dogmas. This potential universality explains why rediscovering these texts has resonated not just with Christian scholars, but with spiritual seekers from all walks of life who find perspectives in them that transcend the limits of particular institutional religious traditions. The contemporary relevance of these ancient texts suggests they tackle fundamental human questions and needs that stay constant across centuries and cultures. The evolution of institutional Christianity in the centuries after Jesus' life revealed a core tension: preserving authentic spiritual teachings versus the political needs of a growing institution. Historical investigations have documented how early Christian communities faced external pressures from the Roman Empire and internal squabbles over different interpretations of the original teachings. In that complex environment, certain spiritual perspectives gradually got shoved to the sidelines, not necessarily because they were wrong, but because they challenged the authority structure the emerging church was building. The Gospel of Thomas, with its emphasis on direct experience and personal knowledge, represented precisely the kind of teaching that could undermine the need for institutional middlemen. Studies on how the biblical canon got put together have revealed that the process of selecting authorized texts was influenced by factors that went way beyond historical accuracy or spiritual depth. Historical sources preserve evidence that texts like the Gospel of Thomas circulated widely among early Christian communities and were considered just as valid as the Gospels that later made it into the New Testament. The big brass in the church made the call to ditch these texts from the official canon, and you can bet they had their reasons that propped up the institutional framework they were building. This realization doesn't necessarily diminish the spiritual validity of the canonical texts, but it sure shines a light on the fact that excluding other texts was as much a political play as a theological one. The biggest game changer in how Jesus' teachings were interpreted happened when Christianity started cooking up elaborate doctrines about Christ's divine nature that put him in a whole different league from ordinary folks. While the teachings preserved in the Gospel of Thomas suggest Jesus saw his own spiritual realization as a model others could follow, later doctrines emphasized his absolute uniqueness, creating an unbridgeable chasm between human and divine that required institutional mediation. This doctrinal transformation effectively made individuals dependent on the church for salvation, thereby cementing the church's grip on power. Specialists have noted that this evolution represents a significant pivot away from the earliest teachings, which emphasized the inherent spiritual potential in every human being. Archaeological digs and old manuscripts tell us that mystical takes on early Christianity were far more common than later official sources would have us believe. Discoveries at places like Nag Hammadi have brought to light a whole damn library of texts that reflect sophisticated spiritual perspectives, emphasizing direct experience, personal knowledge, and the transformation of consciousness. These texts show no evidence of being later deviations or heretical developments. Instead, they seem to preserve traditions that were central to certain groups of early Christians. The sheer diversity of these texts indicates that early Christianity was far more pluralistic than later historical narratives have suggested, with multiple communities developing distinct, but equally valid, interpretations of the original teachings. So here's the kicker. What if the teachings preserved in texts like the Gospel of Thomas represent not deviations from authentic Christianity, but some of the most faithful interpretations of Jesus' original message? This question has implications that go way beyond academic interest, touching fundamental issues about the nature of spiritual authority, the role of religious institutions, and the potential of individual spiritual experience. Modern neuroscience of consciousness has even started providing scientific frameworks for understanding the kinds of spiritual experiences these ancient teachings described, suggesting they might have been pointing toward real, universal aspects of human consciousness rather than just proposing specific religious beliefs. A deep dive into the language of the Gospel of Thomas has revealed structures and formulations that very likely reflect Aramaic oral traditions, possibly tracing back to Jesus' immediate historical period. This linguistic evidence is particularly significant because Aramaic was the language Jesus would have spoken, and the formulations preserved in Thomas show characteristics consistent with that original linguistic background. Specialists have identified patterns of parallelism, wordplay, and rhythmic structures typical of oral transmission in Aramaic, suggesting these teachings might preserve not just the content, but also something of the original form in which they were delivered. This possibility adds weight to the hypothesis that the Gospel of Thomas could contain some of the oldest and most authentic records of Jesus' actual teachings. The systematic crackdown on these alternative perspectives didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process that stretched out over several centuries. Historical sources document deliberate campaigns to scrub texts that didn't conform to the emerging orthodox interpretations, including the burning of libraries, the hounding of groups that preserved these teachings, and the rewriting of history itself to present these perspectives as later deviations rather than legitimate traditions. This suppression process was so effective that until modern archaeological discoveries, these teachings had been virtually wiped clean from the historical record. The effectiveness of this historical erasure raises important questions about how many other authentic spiritual perspectives might have been lost forever. The manuscripts preserved at Nag Hammadi represent just a fraction of the spiritual literature that must have existed in early Christian communities. Scholars estimate that most texts circulating in the first centuries of Christianity are lost forever, victims of both deliberate suppression and the simple march of time. This massive loss means our understanding of early Christianity is based on a very small and potentially biased sample of the teachings and perspectives that actually existed. The Gospel of Thomas, therefore, represents a priceless window into a spiritual world far richer and more diverse than the official sources would have suggested. Its accidental preservation allows us to glimpse the depth and sophistication of spiritual traditions that were systematically sidelined and eventually eliminated by the dominant religious institutions. The sheer muscle of institutional control exerted over spiritual teachings becomes even clearer when we examine the specific machinery they built to enforce orthodoxy. Historical sources reveal complex censorship operations, including official blacklists of forbidden texts, serious penalties for anyone possessing or circulating unauthorized literature, and the development of hierarchical structures that funneled interpretive authority into the hands of a select clerical elite. These mechanisms didn't just pop up. They were refined over centuries until they created a system of doctrinal control that was both sophisticated and utterly ruthless. The contrast between this iron-fisted control and what's preserved in the Gospel of Thomas is pretty stark, as Thomas emphasizes precisely individual spiritual authority and each person's capacity to directly access divine truth. The canonization process that determined which texts would make it into the official Bible and which would be excluded was deeply influenced by political and social considerations that had little to do with spiritual or historical authenticity. Academic studies have documented how the church councils that made these decisions were mainly composed of representatives from Christian factions already holding the reins of political and institutional power, while the voices of communities preserving alternative traditions were systematically shut out of these decision-making processes. This wasn't some accident, it was by design, engineered to ensure that only perspectives supporting the existing power structures were recognized as legitimate. The result was a biblical canon that reflects not so much the real diversity of early Christianity, but rather the doctrinal leanings of the groups that had muscled their way to institutional authority. Archaeological evidence keeps blowing the lid off this lost diversity. Discoveries at sites like Nag Hammadi, Oxyrhynchus, and other spots have brought to light fragments of texts and traditions that paint a picture of early Christianity that's radically different from the official narratives. These finds include not just complete texts like the Gospel of Thomas, but also fragments of Gospels, letters, theological treatises, and liturgical texts that demonstrate the existence of Christian communities with doctrinal perspectives, spiritual practices, and organizational structures very different from what would eventually become Orthodox Christianity. The richness of this diversity suggests that early Christianity was more like a sprawling spiritual movement with multiple currents and interpretations than the unified, doctrinally coherent religion later institutions tried to pass off. What's particularly significant is that many of these alternative traditions seem to have preserved elements of Jesus's teachings that got downplayed or outright scrubbed from the official versions. The focus on direct divine experience, the weight given to inner wisdom, and the notion that the kingdom of heaven is a present reality accessible through a shift in consciousness. These are themes that consistently appear in these alternative texts, but received far less emphasis in the traditions that eventually dominated. This suggests that wiping out these texts didn't just eliminate alternative doctrinal views, it also meant losing key parts of Jesus's original message that just didn't jibe with the institutional ambitions of the burgeoning churches. The patterns of suppression also show that texts pushing individual spiritual authority and direct access to divine experience were especially targeted for persecution. That's not surprising when you consider such teachings were a direct threat to institutional models that relied on clerical middlemen and hierarchical authority. The Gospel of Thomas, with its emphasis that every person has the capacity to directly discover spiritual truth, exemplifies precisely the kind of teaching that organized religious institutions found problematic. The accidental preservation of this text allows us to see what kind of spirituality was actively being suppressed and why the religious authorities felt the need to eliminate it. The methods used to discredit and sideline these alternative perspectives included not just the physical prohibition and destruction of texts, but also sophisticated disinformation campaigns. These campaigns painted these traditions as late deviations, corrupt foreign influences, or baseless heretical fabrications without historical merit. Historical sources document how official apologists cooked up elaborate arguments to explain why these perspectives should be rejected, arguments that often relied more on persuasive rhetoric than objective historical evidence. These campaigns were so successful that many of their claims stuck as established historical truths, until modern archaeological evidence started pulling back the curtain on a very different reality. The real kicker, the bitter irony, is that many of the perspectives suppressed as heretical deviations from pure Christianity might actually represent older, more authentic forms of Jesus' teachings than the versions that eventually became orthodox. This possibility fundamentally challenges conventional historical narratives about the development of Christianity and raises deep questions about the authority and legitimacy of religious institutions that claim to represent Jesus' authentic teachings. If these alternative perspectives preserve important elements of the original message that were later altered or eliminated for institutional reasons, then the historical suppression of these texts represents not just an academic loss, but a spiritual tragedy of monumental proportions. The modern recovery of these lost texts, therefore, isn't simply an academic exercise of historical interest. It's a chance to reconnect with dimensions of spiritual wisdom that were artificially wiped from the public record. The Gospel of Thomas and similar texts offer the possibility of exploring forms of spirituality that emphasize direct experience, personal transformation, and the development of consciousness in ways that can be particularly relevant for contemporary spiritual quests. Studying them doesn't mean ditching established traditions. It means blowing open our understanding of the rich, diverse tapestry of human spiritual heritage. The documented history reveals that the suppression process wasn't simply about preserving doctrinal purity. It involved complex political, economic, and social considerations that determined which spiritual perspectives would be allowed in the ancient world. Researchers have identified specific patterns in how certain texts were selected for destruction, while others were carefully preserved. And these patterns suggest that the criteria weren't always about historical accuracy or sticking to Jesus' original message. Instead, historical sources indicate that texts like the Gospel of Thomas were suppressed because they represented spiritual paths that couldn't be easily controlled or regulated by the emerging institutional powers that be. Analysis of the surviving manuscripts demonstrates that the Gospel of Thomas contains elements that can be traced back to very early traditions, possibly even predating some of the canonical Gospels. This textual evidence has led many specialists to reconsider traditional narratives about the development of early Christianity, and to recognize that the diversity of spiritual perspectives in the earliest Christian communities was far greater than official sources had suggested. The accidental preservation of these texts in places like Nag Hammadi has provided a unique window into spiritual paths that flourished in the centuries right after Jesus' death, but which later got scrubbed from the official historical record. The implications of these discoveries extend beyond mere historical curiosity. They reveal that many of the spiritual ideas folks are chasing today in Eastern traditions or modern spiritual movements might have been right there in early Christian communities before they were shut down for institutional reasons. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, presents concepts about the nature of consciousness, personal transformation, and the direct relationship with the divine that strongly resonate with modern spiritual quests, suggesting these perspectives aren't foreign imports to Christianity, but original elements that were later eliminated. The playbook for burying these alternative perspectives included not only the physical destruction of texts, but also the systematic rewriting of history to make it look like the orthodox views had been the universal truth from day one. Historical documents reveal evidence of organized smear campaigns against teachers and communities holding these alternative perspectives, using propaganda tactics that painted their teachings as corrupt foreign influences, late-stage heresies, or just plain spiritual mumbo-jumbo. These campaigns were so systematic and successful that many of their claims stuck as established historical truths, until modern archaeological evidence began to provide a different picture. The discovery and study of texts like the Gospel of Thomas has revealed that early Christian communities experimented with a much wider variety of spiritual practices than those that survived in later Orthodox traditions. These practices included forms of meditation, techniques for consciousness transformation, and approaches to spiritual development that emphasized direct experience over dogmatic belief. The suppression of these traditions not only eliminated specific spiritual perspectives from the historical record, but also fundamentally changed the nature of Christian spirituality in ways that may have limited its capacity to address people's deep spiritual needs. Specific methods used to marginalize these perspectives included creating historical narratives that presented them as late and deviant developments, despite evidence that many of these traditions may have been contemporary with or even predated the perspectives that eventually became orthodox. Documentary sources show how official apologists developed elaborate arguments to explain why these perspectives should be rejected. Arguments that often relied more on political and strategic considerations than on objective assessments of their historical authenticity or spiritual value. The historical irony is profound. Many of the spiritual perspectives that were suppressed as heretical deviations from pure Christianity may in fact represent more authentic and original forms of Jesus' teachings than the versions that eventually became orthodox. This possibility raises fundamental questions about the nature of religious authority and how spiritual institutions have shaped, and sometimes distorted, the original messages of spiritual founders. If texts like the Gospel of Thomas preserve genuine elements of Jesus' original message that were later altered or removed, then the official history of Christianity may represent not a faithful preservation of the original teachings, but a selective transformation that served specific institutional interests. Scholars have identified specific patterns in the types of teachings that were preserved versus those that were suppressed, and these patterns reveal criteria that had more to do with the ease of institutional control than with historical authenticity. Teachings that emphasized clerical authority, the need for institutional intermediation, and the importance of doctrinal conformity tended to be preserved, while those that emphasized direct spiritual experience, personal authority, and the diversity of spiritual paths tended to be suppressed. This systematic selection resulted in a form of Christianity that privileged uniformity and control over diversity and spiritual exploration. The suppression process also involved altering existing texts to remove or modify passages that supported perspectives considered problematic by the emerging authorities. Textual studies have identified evidence of systematic editing in many of the texts that were eventually included in the official canon, suggesting that even orthodox sources may have been modified to better conform to institutional preferences. This evidence of textual alteration raises additional questions about the authenticity of the versions of Jesus' teachings that have reached us through official channels. The modern recovery of texts like the Gospel of Thomas offers a unique opportunity to reconnect with dimensions of spiritual wisdom that were artificially removed from the official historical record. These texts not only provide valuable insight into early Christian communities, but also offer spiritual perspectives that can be highly relevant to contemporary spiritual quests. Their focus on personal transformation, direct experience of the divine, and the development of consciousness can offer spiritual resources that complement or even surpass those available in established orthodox traditions. The importance of these discoveries extends beyond academic circles because they suggest that modern individuals seeking authentic forms of spirituality may not need to abandon Christianity to find the perspectives they seek, but rather to delve deeper into aspects of Christianity that were historically suppressed, yet are now being recovered through modern research. The Gospel of Thomas and similar texts offer ways of understanding Christian spirituality that may be more compatible with modern sensibilities than traditional Orthodox interpretations. The study of these recovered texts also reveals that the spiritual diversity characterizing the contemporary religious world may not be a modern phenomenon, but rather a return to patterns that existed in early Christian communities before being suppressed for institutional reasons. This perspective suggests that current spiritual plurality may represent not a departure from authentic Christian tradition, but a recovery of its original diversity. The implications of this understanding are profound for both established religious institutions and individuals seeking authentic forms of spiritual development in the modern world. Finally, the history of the suppression and recovery of texts like the Gospel of Thomas illustrates the importance of maintaining an open mind toward unconventional spiritual sources and recognizing that official narratives about religious history may not always tell the whole story. A willingness to explore perspectives that have been marginalized or suppressed can open new possibilities for spiritual growth and understanding, offering resources that can be particularly valuable for navigating the complexities of the spiritual quest in the contemporary world. Thank you for taking the time to delve into these insights. Until next time.